Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Let's have a check of the audio. If you could hear me clearly, please type 1 in the comment section. Then, if everything is okay, we will continue. Okay, Corella, thank you very much. Good morning, Professor L'Homme. Thank you very much for joining us today with our live stream. This is the 132nd session of the Way of Reading, an online linguistic paper reading program. And everybody, as you can see, today we have a very special guest with us in the live stream. Professor L'Homme is one of my favorite researchers because the papers she authored or co-authored are the inspiration of my doctoral thesis. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce Professor L'Homme from the University of Montreal to you. Professor L'Homme is a prominent figure in the fields of lexicography, terminology, and applied linguistics. She has made significant contributions through her research and publications, particularly focusing on lexical semantics and the processing of terms in specialized dictionaries or terminology database. Professor L'Homme has edited and authored several influential works, including Lexical Semantics for Terminology, an Introduction, which was published in 2020, and a Theoretical Perspective on Terminology, Explaining Terms, Concepts, and Specialized Knowledge, which was published in 2022. So in the following 1 hour, Professor L'Homme will guide us in reading one of her papers titled Building Multilingual Specialized Resources Based on FrameNet, Application to the Field of Environment. So without further ado, let's show our warmest welcome to Professor L'Homme by clicking on the like buttons. So Professor L'Homme, now the screen is yours. Over to you now.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. And well, good evening, everyone, because indeed it's the morning here in Montreal, but it's the evening, I guess, for most of the viewers. I'm delighted to be part of this, the Way of Reading live stream. So now I will share my screen. And now you should view the paper itself. So as you mentioned, this paper is about, well, terminological multilingual resources. It's also about frame semantics and FrameNet, and I'll say a lot more about these two aspects of the paper in the presentation. Now I chose to present a conference paper. This paper was presented at the 2020 Global FrameNet Workshop, which was held within the LREC conference, the Language Resources and Evaluation Conference. And this is work I carried out with two other colleagues. So Benoit Robichaud, who's a colleague at the University of Montreal, and Carlos Subirats, who is a colleague at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Carlos is also responsible for the Spanish FrameNet project. Now, as I said, I chose to talk about a conference paper. And well, a conference paper is a challenge both for writers and readers, because these are short papers. This paper is 8 pages long. And as authors, you know, we have to find a way to convey a message and make a point in only 8 pages. And perhaps the community who presents papers at this LREC conference is used to that. But for a linguist, this can be a challenge. because perhaps we're a little bit more talkative than in other areas of knowledge. So in fact, in this paper, many assumptions are implicit, so they're not stated explicitly. We also have to assume that readers have a background, the background needed to understand what is dealt with in the paper. So in this case, we assume that readers had a background in frame semantics and FrameNet, but also in terminology. Now, as I said, this was presented at a global FrameNet workshop. So this, assuming that participants had a background in frame semantics and FrameNet was a pretty safe assumption to make. But once the paper is out there, perhaps we can no longer make this assumption. So today I'll take this opportunity, I have a little bit more time, and I will provide additional explanations, explain things that we took for granted, things that are rather implicit, and perhaps explain some of the shortcuts we took when we wrote this paper. Now, if we look at the abstract, I will not read it. I will not read the entire abstract, but as you can see, this paper is about methodology, and I highlighted the number of times, the number of occurrences of methodology in the abstract. But in fact, of course, we'll talk about methodology, but the paper is also about why we think this methodology is useful and important for terminology. So today, I will focus on these two things. So why we think this work is useful and important, and how we carried out this work. So let me start with these additional explanations I promised I would give. So first of all, perhaps a few words about what terminology is about and what terminologists try to do. So terminologists can be involved in different kinds of projects, but typically these projects will lead to the development of a resource, and these resources can vary. This is a first example, a typical resource called a term bank. And term banks contain terms that are linked to various fields of knowledge. So this is an example of term record taken from the Canadian term bank Termium Plus. A term record will focus on one single concept. So a term record will be linked to one specialized field. Then it will explain this concept with a definition. And if there are multiple ways to express this concept in different languages, these expressions or these labels will be listed on the term record. So in English, we have two different terms or two different designations, and in French, we have a longer list of designations. In some of term banks, and this is the case in Termium, we can also find context, which are sentences that were taken from the corpora used by the terminologists who wrote this term record. Now, a second example is the thesaurus. Now, it's similar to the term bank, but it's also slightly different. So a thesaurus is an entry in a thesaurus also describes one concept. In fact, in this example, you see that two slightly different concepts are described, but typically one entry, one concept. This example is taken from the Gemet thesaurus, which is a thesaurus that focuses on environment terms. Then it will list different names that are given in other languages, names to this for this concept. And the difference between the previous example, the term bank example, is this part here. A thesaurus will mention relations that this concept has with other concepts that are listed in the thesaurus. So typically it will point to broader concepts and also to narrower concepts. Now, the third and final example is that I decided to talk about this morning is the ontology. Terminologists can be involved in the development of ontologies. Now, ontologies are much more formal than the two previous examples. The two previous examples I talked about. It also describes concepts, but it will also describe formally different kinds of relations concepts have with other ones. So this is an example taken from the ENVO ontology, again, an ontology that focuses on the environment. And the example I chose is habitat again. And we can see that habitat is linked to other concepts via different relations. So habitat is defined as a subclass of ecosystem. It has a subclass itself called calyptra habitat. It is linked to a biosphere through a part of relation and to ecosystem decay through a has participant relation. Okay? Now, a more familiar example of what we're trying to do here is the animal species taxonomy, where animals are classified according to their morphology or the way they reproduce. It's more or less the same thing that we're trying to do here, but in a more formal manner. And also the types of relationships that are taken into consideration are much more diversified. Now, maybe you might have noticed that in these resources, the focus is placed on accounting for knowledge, explaining concepts, explaining relations between concepts, and eventually, describing the knowledge structure of a given specialized domain. Now, there is very little linguistic information given in these resources. So if we go back to the term bank, well, we can find, information about the gender of the French terms. We could also consider that contexts are a form of linguistic information because we can see the term in a real sentence. But looking at the thesaurus or the ontology, there is no linguistic information given there. Okay, so this is something we want to contribute to. In this paper, we want to find a way to perhaps, keep this valuable information about concepts, about their relations, about the knowledge structure, but also, find a way to add linguistic information. Right, so the next part I would like to, for which I would like to provide additional explanation are these two components here, frame semantics and FrameNet. Now, today I'll talk much more about FrameNet and its methodology, but of course it is based on frame semantics. So I'll say a few things about frame semantics. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with frame semantics, it is a cognitive linguistics framework, which assumes that was designed or what was suggested by Fillmore in the 70s and 80s. And it assumes that the meaning of linguistic units, or I'll focus today on lexical units and terms, that their meaning is constructed on background knowledge. So when you think about a lexical unit, you activate all this background knowledge. And background knowledge comprises things like, or is built through experience, exposure to social conventions, and so on. Okay? So if we look at a concrete example, if we think of lexical units like inhabit or live, we're thinking about a living somewhere situation. And when we think about this situation, we activate things like, well, people or animates who do the living, And these people can be realized linguistically with units like someone, Peter, or Chen, for example. We're also activating a location, thinking about a location, and this location can be expressed linguistically with units like flat, region, or Montreal. We could also think of things like time in 1996 or last year. Now, when in these situations, some of these, I will call these people and locations in time, we'll call them participants for the time being, some of them are always activated. So in the living somewhere situation, the animates and the location would always be activated. And other participants are only activated occasionally. And this would be the case for time with respect to this living situations, living somewhere situation. Now, FrameNet implements these principles in a resource. And this frame that I just, or this situation that I just described informally is represented or structured in a frame called residence in FrameNet, which is defined as something that has to do with people. These people are labeled as residents who reside in locations and sometimes with a co-resident. Some examples in English are given. Then the participants are listed, and the participants that are always activated are called core frame elements in FrameNet. And this would be the case for resident, location, and co-resident. And the participants that are activated only occasionally are called non-core frame elements. So this would be the case for time that I mentioned earlier, but also for other things like frequency, manner, means, and other non-core frame elements that are listed in the resource. So a FrameNet will also list a certain number of lexical units that are said to evoke this frame. And the list that is given, it comprises nouns and verbs. So things like to camp, inhabitant, to inhabit, to reside, and so on. Excuse me. Now, this is an example taken from the English FrameNet, the Berkeley FrameNet, but there are other FrameNets for other languages. I mentioned the Spanish FrameNet a little earlier, but there's a Japanese FrameNet and many more. Frames can be connected to other frames. So our residence frame is connected to another frame called temporary stay through a inheritance relationship. It is also connected to a colonization frame and a people by residence frame through a used by relation, and it's indirectly connected to other frames such as visiting or visitor departure. Okay, and all. So these two components of FrameNet are very interesting for us. I remind you this issue or this importance that terminology gives to structure and knowledge structure. So we'll see how we can use these different connections for terminology later on. Then FrameNet also provides linguistic information. So for each of those lexical units that evoke a frame, that are listed in the description of a frame, there's information about the way they are used with participants, with frame elements, core and non-core. So syntactic information, also information about valency, the different combinations of frame elements, and finally annotations where we can see how lexical units and frame elements combined in real sentences. Now, this is also very interesting for us. I mentioned earlier that one of the things we wanted to do was to provide more linguistic information in terminological resources. And this is especially interesting since in FrameNet, this linguistic information is connected, or the linguistic description is connected to the conceptual description. And this is what we'll try to keep when applying this to terminology. All right, so coming back to the paper itself, in the introduction, we start by mentioning, previous work, since, of course, we were not the first people who thought it would be a good idea to apply frame semantics or the methodology developed within the FrameNet project to specialized or to terms or to specialized subject fields. Now, FrameNet or frame semantics have been applied to different areas of knowledge like biology. In a paper written nearly 20 years ago, to football, and in this case, we have resources that can be looked up online, to law and computing, and Pimentel and Gazaoui actually did their PhD thesis in Montreal. Then it was applied to linguistics as well. So this is a slightly different application of the FrameNet methodology. In the previous cases, the idea was to propose the development of domain-specific resources. But in the case of linguistics, what the authors did, Malm et al., they suggested a methodology to add linguistic terms to a general language FrameNet, so more specifically the Berkeley frame. Now it was applied to the environment, and this is the work I am presenting today. But other projects apply frame semantics to the environment. There's a group at the University of Granada who have been doing this for a while. This group mentions frame semantics, but developed its own methodology, does not mention FrameNet per se. So this paper was published in 2020, and there are more applications of FrameNet, of the FrameNet methodology or frame semantics to terminology. Other fields like medicine, even food or adventure tourism have been mentioned in the literature, and it also has been applied by you to academic vocabularies. So it seems to be extremely attractive for people working on specialized lexicon. Now, another thing that is mentioned in this paper is that, well, actually, mention was made of specialized vocabulary in frame semantics literature. And for instance, in a paper written in 2010 by Fillmore and Baker, mention is made of the fact that, to acquire a specialized concept such as mathematical concepts such as mantissa, well, this requires previous familiarity, with more basic concepts like base, decimal point. Okay, so the authors state that in fact, the process of acquiring specialized concept requires a lengthy chain of prior learning as a prerequisite to attaining the new concept. So this is all points to, well, it seems interesting, it seems fruitful to apply frame semantics and the FrameNet methodology to terminology. Now, all these authors have different reasons to argue for this. in our case, as I said, and in this paper particularly, the idea was to find a way or to use these frameworks to help us add information about the linguistic properties of terms, but also connect these properties to a sort of conceptual background, to this sort of knowledge background, which is so important for terminologists. So moving on, so I said a little earlier that I would talk about why we think this work is important and useful and how we do it. So the paper is more or less structured that way. So section 2 is about why we think it's important to develop domain-specific FrameNets. And section 3 will be about how we suggest doing this. So why would we spend time developing domain-specific resources, applying frame semantics principles, applying the FrameNet methodology? So of course, there are specialized terms to account for. We already mentioned the mantissa example, and this perhaps is one of a spectacular example in the sense that, well, it's probably a new term for most of us, and it designates a concept that we're unfamiliar with. But in fact, a common mechanism to create terms consists in adding new meanings to existing lexical items. Okay? So if we look at green, for example, well, green does have a certain number of meanings. Well, a color meaning, meaning someone who's unexperienced, but in the environment, it acquired a new meaning that can be paraphrased more or less as that is less damageable or not damageable for the environment. So this is another reason why we would want to, add these meanings and to general language resources, account for these meanings in domain-specific resources. Now, there's another phenomenon which is much more subtle that we often, as terminologists, we often find when we look at lexical units in specialized corpora. And this phenomenon was mentioned by Fillmore itself in 1982, where, there's not a huge difference between the meanings that we know already that can be linked to everyday language and meanings that we see in domain-specific corpora. So Fillmore uses the examples of innocent and guilty, where he says that, well, they basically mean the same thing in everyday language and legal language, but there's an important difference. In everyday language, you're guilty if you committed a crime, but in legal language, you are guilty if you have been declared guilty by the court as a result of a legal action within the criminal system. So this is a subtle difference, but for legal experts, it is extremely important. And we would also want to account for this difference in a domain-specific resource or a legal resource in that case. So we did notice this kind of differences in these kinds of differences in the environment. And for instance, here, we saw that some of these terms were linked to the residence frame that I mentioned earlier. So we found things like inhabit, occupy, but we were talking about endangered species, okay? At some point, we worked on a corpus on endangered species. So if we compare these two situations, of course, they basically mean that they are very similar in the sense that in both cases, we're talking about living entities that make use of a location to carry out daily activities. But if we look at what happens in the endangered species corpus, we're talking about species who use these locations to survive. And if we look at the way the situation is described in FrameNet, we see that the focus is placed on human beings. And these differences can manifest themselves at linguistic levels. So if we compare, for instance, the lexical content of frames, we see that, so here I reproduced the long list that I showed earlier of lexical units that are set to evoke the residence frame in FrameNet. And these are the ones that we found in our corpus on endangered species. So we found things like inhabit, live, and occupy, but of course not things like roommate or squat, for instance. Then other differences concern the number of core and non-core frame elements. We saw that the frame, as it is described in FrameNet, comprises a co-resident, which would seem a little strange, if you talk about, when talking about endangered species. Now, the most important difference that we notice concerns relations that we can establish between frames. If we consider a situation from the point of view of the environment, or from the point of view more specifically of endangered species, the relations that we'll discover or will establish will not be the same as the ones described in a resource like FrameNet, which again focuses on human beings. So this is a comparison of the relations that are described. This I showed a little earlier, the relations as they are described in FrameNet. And these are the ones that we defined in our resource. Okay? So we find the residence frame here with a smaller lexical content. And you can see, just like that, I'll come back to these relations a little later, you can see that the relations are pretty different, and also that they are very domain specific. So perhaps this is not an exception, this residence and the differences that we can see between, the data that we have in our specialized corpora and the descriptions that we can find in FrameNet. We saw many more differences like that. I can give two more examples. For instance, introduce. If you're talking about introduce with respect to endangered species, you're saying that you're placing someone or an organization is placing a species in an area so it can thrive. So if you consider introduce from that perspective, you will link it to terms like introduction, reintroduce, eliminate, extirpate. But if you consider introduce from the perspective of everyday language, well, you'll link it to a different network of lexical units like implant, insert, and place. Okay. So again, basically introduce means it covers, a broad array of situations that are similar. But if you look at it from the point of view of endangered species, you feel compelled to account for the specific situation that it evokes. Now, the final example is something that we also noticed. We saw that in some cases, we felt compelled to make some distinctions that would not necessarily be made if we consider the situation from the perspective of everyday language. And the example I chose here is hunt. again, this field, in relation with this topic of endangered species, we found that one hunt was, an activity or expressed an activity carried out by species to feed and survive. And this hunt is linked to terms like prey, predation, predator. But there was another hunt. This time, this hunt is expressed expresses an activity carried out by human beings, and this hunt can be a threat to endangered species. And in this case, hunt is linked to things like poacher, fish capture, hunter, and so on. Okay? So again, if we want to describe situations within the field of the environment, this is a distinction that we would want to make. All right, so I hope I convinced you. These are the reasons why we think it's useful and important to design domain-specific resources and applying FrameNet to discover some subtle phenomena. Now I will explain how we can do this, the methodology that we set up to do this. So first, I will give you an overview of the methodology. It is given in the paper, but I have a different, perhaps clearer description here. So our methodology is bottom up. Terminologists cannot use their intuition as much as linguists or lexicographers, since they're not experts of the different fields they can be asked to describe. So the first step consists in compiling a specialized corpus. We define some criteria to select texts and so on. So once we're happy with this corpus, we identify terms, and this step is semi-automated. Once we have a list of terms, then we select and extract. We go back to the corpus and select and extract context. Then we define for each term selected an argument structure, and we, based on this argument structure, we annotate context. These first steps are carried out. We work on different languages and are carried out on different languages independently. Okay, so we have corpora for French, for English, for Spanish. We extract terms from each of these languages. And once we did all this, we can start adding entries to a resource that is called the Dico Environ. After that, once we have a sizable number of entries, we start looking for and defining semantic frames. We encode them in a resource that is called framed Dico Environ, and this one is superimposed on the first one, so you can go from one to the other. And once we have a certain number of frames, we can define relations between them. Okay, so for these last steps, the languages that we work on are merged. So a quick word on how we compile corpora. So in fact, the environment is a very, very broad field. So we decided early on to work on specific topics. So we have different corpora for each of these topics. So we have a corpus on endangered species, on transportation, electrification, climate change, and so on. And we have those for the different languages we work on. When we start a new project, we build a corpus of about 500,000 words. So this might seem a little small for people working on general language, but in fact, in terminology, this is a sizable corpus, and we can start working on the different terms. but we do add texts at a later stage if needed. So once we're happy with this corpus, we proceed to identify terms. And this is semi-automated, as I said earlier. We submit our corpus to a term extractor. And the term extractor we use is developed by a colleague of mine, Patrick Drouin, and it's called Thermostat. I will very quickly show the interface. So it's very simple, and this tool is free, so you can register. So you submit your, oops, sorry, I didn't want to do that. So you submit your corpus here. The tool can work on these, well, the online version of the tool can work on all these languages. And then you select the kinds of terms that you want the tool to extract. Single word terms are multi-word terms. And if you work with single word terms, you can select the parts of speech you are interested in. What we do typically is select single word terms, and we select the 4 parts of speech. So verb, adjective, noun, and adverb. Here you have the different corpora that you submitted until you decide to remove them. So in fact, what Thermostat does is take your specialized corpus and compare the relative frequency of the units it contains to the relative frequency of units that are contained in a reference corpus. So going back to the paper, this is an example of the kinds of results you can obtain with Thermostat. So here, these are the results obtained after submitting an English corpus on endangered species. This is the first part of the list of candidate terms. Terms are ordered according to a specificity score, so the statistical calculation of this comparison of relative frequencies between the specialized corpus and the reference one. And well, there are some issues with part of speech tagging and lemmatization, but looking at this list, you know, these are all things that we would consider terms that we would add to our Dico environ. But going down, we might filter out some of the units that the extractor suggests, but that do not correspond to terms. So after we have, once we have a list of terms that we're happy with, we go back to the corpus and extract context with a regular concordancer. And we extract 15 to 20 different contexts. So this is a figure that we determined arbitrarily, but after, you know, a while, we realized that 20 contexts were enough to get a pretty good idea of how the term behaves in a specialized corpus. And even for some of them, there's a little repetition. So at this stage, excuse me, terminologists might have to make semantic distinctions, since the term extractor can differentiate parts of speech, but not different meanings. All right, so the next step consists in defining argument structures for, of course, for predictive units. We also work with the notion of quasi-predicative units. So things like habitat will have arguments. And then we annotate context. And the methodology that we use here is based on the methodology devised for the FrameNet project. So we'll have something that is very similar to what you'll find in FrameNet, where terms are highlighted, they're participants, and they will be labeled, and syntactic information will also be provided. So after this, we can start, as I said earlier, we start adding units to the resource Dico environ. And in the paper, you see some examples of entries that were added to the English, French, Portuguese, and Chinese versions. But I can show the real thing here. Since all these entries can be looked up online, so this would be the entry, this is the entry for species with its argument structure, contexts, annotated contexts, and we also make lists of lexical relations. All right, so once we have a sizable number of entries in the discours environ, we start looking for and defining semantic frames. And here we refer to the methodology developed within the FrameNet project. We also use the criteria that is mentioned to define frames. So the same number of arguments, units, terms should have the same number of arguments. Arguments should be of a similar nature. Some circumstantials or some non-core frame elements should be shared, and terms should denote the same general situation, and so on. In the process, we also compare the information. So we refer a lot to the information provided in FrameNet, and we built a tool to compare the information given for lexical units in FrameNet and terms in the discours environ. So we extract from the XML output of FrameNet the following information. So the lexical unit, its definition, the frame it belongs to, the definition of the frames, the examples that are given, the annotated context, the lists of participants and the relations. And from the discours environ, we extract the argument structure, the definition that we gave to the frame, and then the way we align what we defined as the labels we use and the ones used in FrameNet, and the lexical units or the terms that we associate with this frame. And finally, annotated context. So we have tables. In this case, we align the two inhabits because we consider that we're talking about the same general situation with some adaptations. But in some cases, the alignment is not possible. This would be the case for green, for instance. The environmental meaning was not at the time included in FrameNet. So we, once we define frames, we encode them in a resource that we called framed discours environ, and I could show you what it looks like. It's very similar. The information given is very similar to the kind of information you'll find in FrameNet. So this is our residence frame. So a definition using the labels we used for participants, then examples taken from our corpora. We mention if the frame is based on one that appears in FrameNet, and this link will lead you to FrameNet. Then core frame elements, non-core frame elements, these are extracted from the annotations, and the terms that were found to evoke this frame in English and in French. In some cases, there are other languages, but in this case, only French and English terms were ready to be added to this frame. Okay. If you click on this part here, you can also have, see how our description differs from the one given in FrameNet. So you can see the labels used in FrameNet for core frame elements, non-cores. You can see the terms that we added to this frame that cannot be found in FrameNet, and the lexical units that are found in FrameNet, but that are not found in our description of the residence frame. Right, so we do this, we define a certain number of frames, and once we have a sizable number of frames, we start describing relations between them. And again, here we use the list of relations that is given in FrameNet, but we did add things like inheritance, causation, is causative of, is inchoative of. But we did add two relations that seem to be relevant for our data. We added opposition and property as well. So once we have a certain number of relations, we build what we call scenarios, which tell a little story about what happens in the environment. And these are, again, found in the Frame Environ. So this is the homepage of the Frame Environ, and these are the different scenarios that we have developed up to now using these relations. And these account for things that are relevant for the environment. So everything that has to do with locations, the earth, with life, and so on. And if we take a look at this one here, species, activities, and life, our residence frame could be somewhere in there. So it's here, and it's connected to other frames that have to do with being somewhere for endangered species. So we have one called distribution that contains terms like range, so range from one location to another. We have a frame called species colonization that will account for the fact that species can occupy a location, but their number is growing and they're sort of settling in that location. And we also have a frame for a situation where someone or an organization places or introduces a species in a specific location. But species can do many other things, and this is what these frames are telling us. They migrate, they hibernate, they feed, they hunt in a certain way, they procreate, and so on. So if we contrast this scenario to another one that describes the different activities that human beings carry out, we have a completely different picture. So human beings, based on the data that we found, are involved in all sorts of activities as well, but activities that have to do with using resources, manufacturing, developing, cutting trees, cultivating, overfishing, and so on. Okay, so this is our methodology. And what the paper mentions is also, gives some figures, because this is ongoing work. And this table here shows the frames that we have developed up to now, or rather that we had developed up until 2020. Now we have a little bit more than 200 frames. And these figures show you that, well, in many cases, we have to define new frames. So frames that cannot be found as such in FrameNet. But we do use some frames as such. They do apply to the data we find. And in other cases, we have to make, minor modifications. So the number of arguments is not exactly the same. So the overall situation is similar, but there are some slight differences. And here you have the distribution of terms in each of these frames in each language. So you can see that French has the broadest coverage because we are native speakers of French. Then English comes second because, well, we live in Canada. And for other projects, well, we rely on collaborations with native speakers. Then some figures about the annotations. Again, this has increased because we're still annotating sentences, contexts. Again, French comes first. So the paper ends with, well, some lines for future work. In fact, So again, I said that this is ongoing work. So we're still in the process of adding terms to the dico environ, defining new frames, establishing relations between these new frames and other ones. But we've been working on this for a while, and what we managed to, we can say now that our methodology and infrastructure can easily be extended to new languages. So when someone is interested in working on a new language in the field of the environment, we can, adapt our tools to this new language quite quickly. Now we're in the process. We just started a new project on the Innu language, which is an important language, indigenous language in Canada. So there will be some adaptation required, and maybe in this case, there will be a little bit more than minor adaptations. One area for future work that is mentioned in the paper, which would be very interesting, and all this issue of how situations are conceptualized in everyday language and specialized domains. I just touched upon it in the paper. We just touched upon it in the paper, and I just mentioned it very quickly today, but this is an area that would be very, very interesting to investigate. All right, so I can, that would be the end of the presentation, and I'm ready to answer some questions.
Thank you so much, Professor L'Homme. I believe everybody will be, just like me, have learned a lot from this guided reading. Actually, we read one paper written by Professor Faber just several weeks ago. That paper is about turning the terminology database into ontology. That's a conceptually quite difficult one. We spent 2 sessions in reading it. And I believe in the beginning of this session, you also talk about the connection between the terminology database and ontology. And so let's help us to understand that paper too. And I also appreciate that you gave a brief introduction to FrameNet and the frame semantics. Many participants are interested in this. They have told me to, some of the participants are asking me to give an introduction, but since you have already done this, thank you so much. So to the audience, if you have any questions, please post your question in the comment section. I'll read the question to Professor L'Homme. While you are thinking about your question, I'll take the privilege of being the host to ask the first question. Actually, I have several questions, but I'll ask the first one first. So how you mentioned the example of inhabitant. So do they evoke different frames? Do you define different frames for inhabitants in the environment FrameNet? In the deco.
You mean the lexical? Sorry, the lexical unit inhabitant.
Yes.
Well, as the last time I looked, the inhabitant and other things like tenant, I think, appear in the residence frame. So this would mean that they evoke the residence frame according to FrameNet. Was that your question?
Maybe I put it this way. How about in this deco enviro? I cannot pronounce it in French. So do you define a different frame for this lexical unit? Because the frame elements that's associated with this lexicality in this, in this subject is very different from those defined in FrameNet. So do you find it necessary to define a new frame, or expand the the original frame in FrameNet in terms of frame elements?
Yeah, well, in fact, to look at this particular example, inhabitant in the field of the environment would be a person and not an endangered species. So for us, that would be a different frame because our residence frame accounts for endangered species who occupy, that live in an area. So inhabitant, talking about a person, would be in a different frame.
Currently, they have this. They share the same name, but they're different frame.
Well, yeah. In FrameNet is one thing. So in FrameNet, to my knowledge, inhabitant, inhabit, tenant, live are placed in the residence frame. But if we look at this from the perspective of the environment, we would, and if we had to describe inhabitant from this perspective, it wouldn't be in the same frame because our residence frame accounts for endangered species that live in a specific area.
Yes, I agree with you. So,
sorry.
The reason I ask this question is, if they are, they evoke different frames, will there be some relationship between these two frames?
Let's see. Well, in our resource, the inhabitant, human inhabitant, would be linked to other frames that account for names given to human beings. We do have frames like that, frames for names given to experts, frames a frame defined for names given to developers or farmers, people using the resources provided by the earth. I think it would be it would be linked to those frames rather than to the residence frame. Our residence frame. So perhaps to give a more general answer to your question, when you work on these specialized domains, you have a certain perspective. The terms give a certain perspective on knowledge. They give you a window they open a window on knowledge, and they give you a certain perspective, and you have to account for this perspective in one way or another. I think, and this can differ from the perspective taken by people who develop FrameNet for other different objectives.
Yes, yeah. So these two frames, even though they are evoked by the same lexical unit, they have a whole different network behind them. Their relationship with other frames are very different. So does this mean that we should keep, the domain-specific FrameNet separate from the FrameNet, or is it possible to integrate domain-specific FrameNets into FrameNet in some way? If we choose the latter, we kind of have to, account for the relationship between those frames.
Yes, this is very interesting, a very interesting idea, and to show the connections between the descriptions given in FrameNet that account for a certain conceptualization and the frames that appear in domain-specific resources that account for other kinds of conceptualizations. But this is an area of research which is very interesting, but I think that still needs to be investigated. What we tried to do, as I showed, is at least in our frames, provide the information that can be found in FrameNet. So this is a start, but of course we could go much more further. But it's very, very interesting. So anyone interested, I would encourage them to investigate in those areas.
So we're still waiting for a question from the audience. If you have any questions, please type in the comment section. Maybe this is a difficult topic for many of us, so they're still thinking about the questions. But I still have other questions. I have several questions actually. I read your 2021 paper, revisiting terminology, revisiting polysemy in terminologies. I think that some of those issues, the difference between the same lexical form used in different fields are also related to the polysemous nature of some words. I found the same problems with genre-specific frames. The same words, the same word forms, they tend to have different meanings in different genres. This is related to something you mentioned in your presentation, that you exclude some of the terms that are extracted from the terminologists software because you find they are not actually terms. So I can't help thinking that since they have been extracted by the software, they must have differ themselves from lexical units used in the reference corpora. My assumption is that those words, they are not terms, so they are not domain specific, but they might be genre specific. So what I did.
Yes. So I think you're right. Yeah, sorry. I think you're right, actually. This tool works with frequency and relative frequency. So itself, the frequency is informative, gives us information about the importance of this unit in the corpus. Now, we, of course, are looking for terms, so we will discard some units that we think do not correspond to terms, but there must be something special about these units, and perhaps you're right, they are genre-specific. Yeah.
I mentioned this because that's exactly where your research inspired me. Then I look at those things you exclude because I think they are genre-specific. So in my research, I kind of do exactly the opposite of what you did. I exclude those terms, and I specifically look at those genre-specific lexical units. This is not really a question. It's a comment.
No, but in fact, it's interesting. Some terminologists have also been looking into these units because we run into them as terminologists. We see there's something special. We feel that they do not correspond to terms, but we feel that they do contribute something special to the text,
yes,
to the corpus. And there is some literature on trying to distinguish, differentiate domain-specific terms from units that are more genre-specific unit. Yeah, and then general lexical units. So you would have like three different levels, three different categories of units that appear in specialized corpora.
Yes. And I have another question. Maybe it's just a flash thought. Should we define an abstract ontological frame for the entire domain?
Well, I would find this very difficult. Well, if we apply the FrameNet methodology, I can't see how we can have one overall general frame. I don't see how. Yeah.
So we should not do that based on the frame semantics principles.
Well, I think the connections between frames tell us a little bit more about, if we think about the residence frame, there are different ways of living somewhere, and this gives you, but then if you want to account for communication, how would you include this in one single representation method? Well, unless it's disconnected from the linguistic data. If we want to keep this connection between the conceptual level and the linguistic data, and we do this consistently, I think it would be difficult to produce this very general overall frame for everything.
Yeah, I agree with you. And also I remember that in one of your paper you mentioned the problems of those complicated nominal phrases, which are made up of several nouns. But in different languages, those nouns are put in different orders. And the same is true of Chinese. So my question is that how would a database like DecoInval help solve this problem in translation?
You mean the combination of nouns? Nouns
Yeah, the combination of
modifying
nouns, yeah, modifying nouns. This happen a lot in terminologies. There's
yeah.
very long terminologies comprising of several nouns. I just encountered one several days ago. My wife asked me to translate a terminology. It's actually a title of it comprises, no, I have here, it's a Chinese. It has 14 Chinese characters, but there are several different ways to divide those, those Chinese characters. Chinese tend to be ambiguous because you can combine the characters in different ways and have produce different meanings. So before I translate it, I have to figure out exactly the way that should be divided. So how does this frame-based terminology database help solve this problem?
Well, I don't think it has, direct answers to a specific case you would run into. But there are many clues, I think, to solve the kinds of problems that you mentioned. Sometimes knowledge or domain knowledge is required to disambiguate these combinations. In French, it's a little bit easier because it's an inflect, if there are adjectives in there, they will be inflected. We also use prepositions between nouns, and sometimes this can give clues about the relationships between nouns. Now in English and Chinese, it's a different story. But, there are contexts, many annotated contexts in the DecoInval that could help. Because these contexts are, the parts of these contexts are, let's say we highlight the unit, we highlight the relation between the argument and the term, sometimes a circumstantial in the term, and I think this could help. Yeah, but if you're looking for, a resource that, okay, for this long noun phrase, what does it mean? Well, the DecoInval doesn't provide that kind of information. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question from the audience, and someone is interested in the application of these principles to linguistics, the terminologies in linguistics. So his question is, I'm not sure whether it's a his or her question. So can we do the same thing to linguistics, the terminologies in linguistics? Or has anyone already done it?
Well, there's this paper I mentioned, and which is mentioned in the article I presented, a paper presented at the 2018 Global FrameNet workshop that deals with linguistics. Now, in this paper, the idea is not to develop a domain-specific resource in linguistics, but rather add terms, linguistics terms, to a general language FrameNet. But there are probably interesting pointers in there. Now, to answer the question, would it be possible? I think so. I think the methodology I presented, you could build a corpus with text on linguistics, then extract terms and carry out the different steps that I mentioned. I think these can be applied to many other different fields of knowledge.
Yeah, I think so too, because linguistics is also a domain, right? So the same principles can be applied to any domain, I think.
Yes, and in this case, if you're a linguist, you also have domain knowledge for things like the environment or law or, terminologists. I'm not a legal expert, so if I had to work on legal text, then I would, of course, you build your corpus, you extract terms, but you need some input that come from experts. And perhaps if you're a linguist, you need a little bit less of that input because you can make some decisions yourself.
Thank you so much. I think maybe people are not very familiar with FrameNet and they find this paper very difficult. There's not many questions asked from the audiences. But I do have a final question. This question, because I work in applied linguistics kind of, so every time after you present a paper in an applied linguistic conference, people will surely ask this question. What is the pedagogical use of your research? I have been asked this question every time when I present a paper in at a conference. So
the pedagogical applications?
Yes.
Well, that's a good question, actually. We're not trying to develop pedagogical applications, but I had some students working on this, 2 PhD students. One of them worked on developing ways to help translation students make fine-grained semantic distinctions based on the descriptions that are given and the kinds of descriptions that are given in the Dico Environ. And another student worked on helping French speakers learn Chinese, but advanced learners learn terms in the field of computing, find out how these terms are used, use contextual information to help them, use lexical relations to help them as well. So there are, I think, some pedagogical applications. I didn't work on those myself, but other people have.
Thank you so much. So I think I have a mission in the future to promote frame semantics and frame semantics related researches to more audience in China, so that people have more interest in this topic. Thank you so much, Professor L'Homme, and thank you all for participating in this guided reading live stream session. And let's call it a day. We hope to, Professor L'Homme, we hope to see you again in our live stream session. Have a nice weekend, everyone. And Professor L'Homme, have a nice weekend.
And you too.